The engine noise was deafening, even through the thin plywood walls. Staff Sergeant Mike Murphy sat in the cramped fuselage of Waco glider number 42, his back pressed against canvas that rippled in the slipstream, watching the tow rope stretch and slack ahead of them like a living thing. It was 4 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, somewhere over the English Channel. In 90 minutes, American boys would be dying on beaches with names they couldn't pronounce. But Murphy and the 12 men crammed around him, along with a quarter-ton jeep strapped down behind them, were going in first. The glider shuddered as tracer rounds stitched through the darkness below. Murphy caught the eye of the young private across from him, a kid from Nebraska who'd been bragging yesterday about the farm equipment he could fix. The private wasn't bragging now. His knuckles were white on his rifle, and Murphy could see him mouthing what looked like a prayer. Nobody talked much in a glider. The screaming wind, the groan of overstressed plywood, and the hammering of your own heart made conversation pointless anyway. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Through the small window, Murphy could see other gliders in the formation, dark shapes against darker sky, each one carrying its cargo of men and steel toward the hedgerows of Normandy. Somewhere ahead, German soldiers were probably laughing about these flimsy American contraptions. He'd heard the intelligence reports intercepted German communications, calling them plywood coffins, mocking the Americans for sending their troops to war in what amounted to oversized kites. The Germans had a point. The CG-4A Waco glider was hardly an impressive machine. 83 feet of wing attached to a frame of steel tubing, wrapped in fabric and sheets of plywood barely thicker than a man's thumb. No armor, no engines, no weapons. When Murphy had first seen one sitting on the tarmac at Fort Bragg, his first thought was that it looked like something a high school shop class might build. His second thought was that he was going to have to fly into combat in one. But here's what the Germans didn't understand, couldn't understand, because it was so fundamentally American that it might as well have been written in a language they'd never learned. These fragile machines weren't a sign of weakness. They were a sign of terrifying industrial might. Because while the Luftwaffe was carefully handcrafting a few dozen sophisticated combat gliders, 16 different American companies, from the Waco Aircraft Company in Troy, Ohio, to the Ford Motor Company's plant in Michigan, were churning out CG-4 as by the thousands. Not hundreds, thousands. Nearly 14,000 of them would be built before the war ended, more than the total number of B-17 Flying Fortresses, more than P-38 Lightnings, more than any single American bomber or fighter in production. The Germans mocked the plywood. They should have been terrified of the assembly line. Murphy felt the glider bank slightly as the C-47 tow plane ahead adjusted course. They were approaching the coast now. He could feel it in the way the other men tensed, in the sudden silence that fell over even the nervous shuffling. Somewhere below, in concrete bunkers and behind hedgerows, German machine gunners were tracking the sound of engines, fingers tightening on triggers, waiting for the first shadow to cross into range. The young private from Nebraska was crying now, silent tears tracking down his cheeks. Murphy didn't blame him. In a few minutes, their tow rope would be cut, and they would drop out of the sky like a stone with wings, heading toward a field they'd studied on maps but never seen, aiming for a landing zone that intelligence said was clear, but that Murphy suspected would be anything but. The pilot would have maybe one chance to get it right, to put them down without slamming into a tree or a stone wall or one of the obstacles Rommel had ordered planted across every viable landing field in northern France. If they survived the landing, they'd pile out into what was certain to be a hot landing zone, with German troops who'd spent years preparing for this moment. The glider would probably be a write-off, damaged beyond repair by the crash landing it was designed for, and Murphy and these 12 scared kids would be on their own, miles behind enemy lines, with whatever ammunition they could carry and whatever determination they could muster. This was the gamble. This was the massive, improbable bet that American commanders had placed on these flimsy machines and the men inside them. And the truly audacious part, the part that would never make sense to anyone who hadn't seen American factories work, who hadn't watched the impossible become routine, was that this wasn't even the main assault. This was just the opening move. The beginning of understanding this story requires understanding what the glider program represented to both sides in 1944. For the Germans, military aviation was an art form, a question of engineering excellence and tactical sophistication. Their gliders, the DFS 230 seconds that had captured Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium with surgical precision back in May of 1940, were beautiful machines, carefully crafted for specific missions. The assault on that fortress had been brilliant. 11 gliders carrying 78 specially trained troops, landing on the roof of what was considered an impregnable fortification, neutralizing it in 20 minutes. That operation had sent shockwaves through military establishments worldwide. The Americans had watched with particular interest because it revealed a new kind of warfare. The ability to put trained soldiers exactly where you needed them, silently, with the element of complete surprise. Parachute drops were loud, scattered, and unpredictable. Gliders could deliver troops and heavy equipment, jeeps, artillery pieces, even light tanks to precise locations. But the American response to Eben-Emael wasn't to try to match German sophistication. It was to drown the problem in production. By the time Murphy's glider crossed the French coast that morning, the United States had trained over 6,000 glider pilots, had airfields dedicated to nothing but glider operations, and had enough gliders in inventory to deliver entire divisions behind enemy lines if needed. The irony was perfect and brutal. The Germans had invented modern glider warfare, had perfected it, had used it to devastating effect, and now, 4 years later, they were about to experience it at a scale they had never imagined possible. Murphy felt the tow rope go slack. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the nose dropped, and they were falling, gliding, descending toward whatever waited below. The pilot was calling out altitude numbers, his voice tight with concentration. Someone was praying in Spanish. The jeep creaked against its restraints. They hit hard. The sound was catastrophic: wood splintering, metal screaming, men shouting. Murphy was thrown forward, his helmet slamming into something solid, stars exploding across his vision. The glider skidded sideways, tearing through what felt like brush or small trees, the noise of destruction overwhelming everything else. Then, suddenly, stillness. Murphy's ears were ringing. Blood ran hot down the side of his face from where his helmet had split the skin above his eyebrow. But he was alive. He could move. Around him, men were groaning, cursing, checking themselves for serious injury. The co-pilot was slumped forward. Unconscious or dead Murphy couldn't tell in the darkness. But the pilot was moving, already fighting to unlatch the nose section of the glider. Out! 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 Murphy heard himself shouting, though his voice sounded distant and muffled. The side door was jammed. A Sergeant Murphy didn't know kicked it once, twice, 3 times, and it flew open. Cool morning air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of earth and smoke and something burning. They stumbled out into a field. Not their designated landing zone. Murphy realized immediately they'd come down at least a mile off target, maybe more. Around them, scattered across the Norman countryside, were other gliders, some intact, some reduced to piles of broken plywood and torn canvas, and in the distance, the unmistakable sound of small arms fire. The private from Nebraska helped pull the jeep from the wrecked glider. Miraculously, it was mostly intact, though one wheel was bent and the windshield was gone. They'd lost half their ammunition in the crash, buried somewhere in the wreckage. But they were down, they were alive. And scattered across this landscape were thousands of other American soldiers who'd arrived the same way, in these disposable, flimsy, brilliant machines. What the Germans were about to learn, in the most visceral way possible, was that American warfare in 1944 wasn't about craftsmanship. It was about mass. It was about the ability to lose half your gliders on landing and still have overwhelming force on the ground. It was about factories that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. It was about taking something the Germans had invented, stripping it down to its essential function, and producing it at a scale that transformed tactics into something else entirely. Industrial warfare, where quantity itself became a weapon. Murphy organized his scattered squad, took stock of what they had left, and started moving toward the sound of fighting. Behind him, the glider that had carried them across the channel that had been built in 6 weeks by workers who'd never seen combat, that had cost the equivalent of what the government spent on a jeep lay broken in a French field. Its job done. 14,000 more where that came from, Murphy thought grimly. Let the Germans mock the plywood, let them laugh at these disposable machines. They were about to discover that America hadn't sent sophisticated weapons to war. They'd sent a factory. The doctrine of airborne warfare in World War II was rooted in a single devastating truth. Traditional military advances were predictable. Armies moved along roads, through valleys, across rivers at bridges. Defenders could prepare for these movements, could fortify the logical approaches, could channel attackers into kill zones where artillery and machine guns could extract terrible costs. But what if soldiers could simply appear behind those defences? What if the first indication of an attack came when paratroopers or glider troops were already on the ground, already moving toward objectives that were supposed to be safe in the rear? Germany had demonstrated this concept spectacularly in the war's early years. Their Fallschirmjäger paratroops, combined with glider-borne forces, had seized key positions in Norway, Holland, Belgium, and Crete. Each operation had showcased the psychological impact of sudden, unexpected attack from above. Soldiers who thought they were in safe rear areas suddenly found themselves in direct combat. Supply lines that seemed secure were cut. Command posts were overrun. The German theory was elegant. Use elite troops, highly trained and carefully selected, delivered by sophisticated aircraft to precise objectives. Quality over quantity. Precision over mass. The American theory, developed through 1942 and 43, was characteristically different. What if we could do this with everybody? What if airborne warfare wasn't the province of elite commandos, but of regular infantry, delivered in such numbers that they could seize not just bridges and fortifications, but entire regions? This was the thinking behind the massive expansion of the U.S. glider program. By 1943, the United States had 2 full airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, with glider infantry regiments as core components. These weren't special forces in the German sense. They were regular soldiers who'd been trained to arrive at the battlefield by glider instead of by truck. The training for these men was grueling but straightforward. They learned to fight with whatever equipment survived the landing. They learned to assemble in darkness and chaos, to find their objectives when half the unit was scattered across miles of countryside. They learned that a glider landing was, by definition, a crash landing, and that their job was to walk away from that crash and start fighting. For the pilots, the training was even more intensive. These were men who'd washed out of powered flight training, not skilled enough to fly fighters or bombers, but possessed of enough natural ability to handle an aircraft in the air. They learned to fly the Waco glider, to understand its peculiar characteristics, how it handled in tow, how it behaved when released, how to judge a glide path when you had no engine and only one chance to get it right. The CG-4A was not an unforgiving aircraft. Its specifications told the story. Wingspan of 83.5 feet, fuselage length of 48 feet, empty weight of 3,750 pounds. It could carry up to 4,000 pounds of cargo, roughly its own weight. Maximum towing speed was 150 miles per hour. Gliding speed was 72 miles per hour. Rate of descent was about 700 feet per minute, which meant that from a release altitude of 2,000 feet, a pilot had less than 3 minutes to find a suitable field, line up an approach, and put the glider down without killing everyone inside. The floor was honeycomb plywood, strong enough to support a jeep or a 75mm howitzer. The nose section could swing upward on hinges, creating a cargo door 60 inches wide by 72 inches high, just barely large enough to drive a vehicle through. The whole thing was held together with glue, screws, and hope. German engineers who examined captured Waco gliders were apparently incredulous. The construction was crude by their standards, the materials cheap, the finish rough. These were machines built for one mission, by workers who were furniture makers and automobile assemblers retrained for aircraft production. There was no elegance to them, no sophistication. What the German analysts missed, what they couldn't see from examining the wreckage, was the supply chain behind these machines. The lumber mills converting timber to plywood, the steel mills producing tubing, the fabric manufacturers weaving canvas, the assembly plants where women who'd been homemakers 6 months earlier were now riveting frames and stretching fabric over wings. This was warfare at a scale the world had never seen. Not better machines, more machines, overwhelmingly, endlessly more. By the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the glider fleet was ready. Hundreds of Wacos sat on British airfields, lined up wing to wing. Thousands of glider infantry had trained until they could assemble their equipment in darkness, could move cross-country with only a compass and an objective. The plan was audacious. Before the first soldier hit the beaches, airborne forces would land behind German coastal defences, seize key bridges and crossroads, cut communications, and create chaos in the German rear. The Germans knew it was coming. Their intelligence had picked up the massive aerial activity in southern England. They'd reinforced coastal areas, planted obstacles in likely landing fields, thick wooden posts nicknamed Rommel's asparagus that would tear a glider to pieces on landing. They'd positioned artillery to cover open ground. They'd prepared, as best they could, for airborne assault. What they hadn't prepared for, what they couldn't prepare for, was the sheer magnitude. Not dozens of gliders, hundreds, not hundreds of soldiers, thousands. On the night of June 5, 1944, the Armada began to take off. First, the pathfinders, paratroopers who would mark drop zones and landing zones. Then the main paratrooper force, carried in C-47 seconds that droned across the channel in massive formations. And then, in the pre-dawn darkness, the gliders. Mission Chicago delivered 52 CG-4, gliders to Landing Zone E, carrying elements of the 101st Airborne Division's artillery and command staff. Mission Detroit put another 52 gliders down near Sainte-Mère-Église, delivering the 82nd Airborne's heavy weapons and vehicles. The landings were chaos. Pilots approaching in darkness couldn't see obstacles. Anti-aircraft fire tore through formations. Some tow-plane pilots, under fire, released their gliders too early, miles from the intended landing zones. Some gliders came down in the wrong fields, in swamps, in German-occupied villages. The crashed wreckage littered Norman fields, twisted metal, torn fabric, splintered wood. The casualties among glider troops were horrific by any standard. The 101st Airborne lost 30 men just in crash landings before they even engaged the enemy. The 82nd lost nearly 300. Gliders slammed into stone walls, flipped in soft ground, broke apart when overloaded jeeps tore through the nose section. Some pilots were killed instantly when the control yoke was driven through their chest on impact. Some troops were crushed by their own equipment. But here's what the statistics also showed. Despite all that carnage, despite a 10% casualty rate just from landing, the operation worked. By dawn on June 6th, roughly 4,000 American troops had been delivered behind German coastal defences by glider, carrying with them jeeps, artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, radio equipment, ammunition that paratroopers couldn't carry. Those troops seized key objectives. They held bridges. They established defensive positions. They created exactly the chaos and confusion in the German rear that the plan had called for. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that this could be done at scale, that airborne operations weren't limited to small commando raids, but could be used to deliver entire units deep into enemy territory. The Germans, monitoring the situation from their headquarters, began to understand what they were facing. This wasn't surgical precision. This was a hammer blow. The Americans weren't trying to be clever. They were simply overwhelming the defense with numbers. A German after-action report from the 716th Infantry Division, defending the Normandy coast, captured the bewilderment. The enemy's airborne operations were conducted with a disregard for casualties that borders on fanaticism. Gliders continued to land even when landing zones were under direct fire. Many crashed, but more arrived. The truth about the American glider program began to sink in for German forces not on D-Day itself, but in the weeks that followed, as they captured American positions and interrogated prisoners. What they found contradicted everything their propaganda had told them about American fighting capability. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, a company commander in the 91st Air Landing Division, wrote in his diary about examining a downed American glider near Carentan. The construction is laughable. Children's toys are built more substantially, and yet they came in hundreds. The fields are littered with their wreckage, and still the Americans fight with undiminished strength. How many of these cursed machines do they possess? The answer, had Weber known it, would have staggered him. By mid-1944, American factories were producing CG-4A gliders at a rate of more than 300 per month. The Ford plant alone was turning out one complete glider every 4 hours. This wasn't craftsmanship, it was industrial process, assembly line warfare applied to aircraft. What Weber and his fellow German officers were beginning to recognize was a fundamental shift in how war could be waged. They'd been taught to think in terms of quality, better training, better equipment, better tactics. The Americans were thinking in terms of capacity, enough training, enough equipment, enough tactics, and so much of everything that losses became acceptable, even expected. A captured German intelligence report from July 1944, now in the National Archives, provides a window into this dawning realization. The report analyzes American airborne operations and notes with evident frustration. The enemy appears to calculate glider losses of 30 to 40% as acceptable. This suggests either criminal disregard for their soldiers' lives or access to replacement equipment on a scale that makes such losses tactically irrelevant. Given American industrial capacity, we must assume the latter. The report was correct. The Americans had indeed calculated acceptable loss rates, and those calculations were breathtakingly cold-blooded. War planners estimated that half the gliders might be destroyed or damaged beyond use on landing. They planned accordingly, building twice as many gliders as they needed for any given operation. This was the difference between the two approaches to warfare. German planning asked, "How can we accomplish this mission with minimal losses?" American planning asked, "How can we accomplish this mission regardless of losses?" The first approach led to careful, limited operations. The second led to overwhelming force. The psychological impact on German soldiers of this American abundance became a recurring theme in intelligence reports throughout the war. When German prisoners were transported to camps in the United States, many gained weight during their captivity. One prisoner famously reported going from 128 pounds at capture to 185 pounds as a POW. They ate the same rations as American soldiers, which included meat at nearly every meal, real coffee, and cigarettes as standard issue. German prisoners were stunned to discover that American privates, the lowest-ranking soldiers, were paid 80 cents per day, equivalent to about $15 in today's currency. They received new uniforms whenever needed. Their boots were leather, not the ersatz materials Germany had resorted to. When German POWs worked in American camps, they were paid for their labor and could buy luxury items like beer and chocolate at camp canteens. This abundance extended to the battlefield. American units operated with supply lines that seemed impossible to German eyes. An American infantry division consumed roughly 650 tons of supplies per day: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. The logistics to maintain that flow required thousands of trucks, entire fleets of cargo ships, and an industrial base back home that could produce replacement equipment faster than it could be destroyed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The glider program exemplified this approach. After Normandy, the Americans didn't pause to perfect their tactics or refine their equipment. They simply did it again, larger. Operation Market Garden in September of 1944 was the biggest airborne operation attempted to that point in the war. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed seizing a series of bridges across Holland, creating a corridor for Allied armour to drive into Germany's industrial heartland. American airborne divisions would seize bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British airborne forces would take the bridge at Arnhem. The glider component was massive. Over the course of 3 days, more than 2,000 gliders, both American Wacos and British Horsas, would deliver troops and equipment to landing zones in occupied Holland. It was Market Garden that truly demonstrated the scale at which glider operations could be conducted. First Lieutenant James Di Pietro, a glider pilot with the 81st Squadron, flew into Holland on September 17th. His account, preserved at the Air Mobility Command Museum, captures both the scale and the chaos. We took off early morning. I was assigned a Horsa with 29 men aboard, fully equipped. As soon as we took off, we noticed the left wing felt heavy. We had to fight it all the way to Holland. It was just about daylight when we flew over Arnhem Beach and turned inland. We could see gliders everywhere, some landing, some already crashed. The fields looked like a junkyard. Di Pietro's glider made it down intact, a minor miracle given that he was fighting a damaged wing the entire flight. But his experience illustrated the casual acceptance of risk that characterized American glider operations. A damaged aircraft that German pilots might have aborted? The Americans flew it anyway. If it crashed, there were more gliders, more pilots, more troops. The landings in Holland were devastating. German anti-aircraft fire was intense, as defenders had learned from Normandy and were now better prepared. The Dutch terrain, much of it reclaimed from the sea, soft and treacherous, made landings even more dangerous than the Norman hedgerows. Gliders broke apart, flipped, skidded into irrigation ditches, and yet they kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour, for 3 days. Some landing zones were under direct fire when gliders arrived, and pilots had to find alternate fields while under attack. Some gliders were hit by flak before they could release from their tow planes and spiraled down in flames. Some made perfect landings only to have their occupants cut down by machine gun fire as they exited. The human cost was terrible. But the material cost, the gliders themselves, was barely noted. They were expendable. After Market Garden, salvage crews were sent to recover what gliders they could, but most were simply abandoned. Broken plywood and torn canvas littered Dutch fields. Local farmers used the wreckage for firewood and building materials. The Germans counted the destroyed gliders and calculated that the Americans had lost perhaps half their force just in the landings. Surely, they reasoned, this would force a pause, a reassessment of tactics. Surely the Americans would need to rebuild their glider fleet before attempting another operation. They were wrong on both counts. By December of 1944, when German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, American airborne troops were again deployed, this time to hold the critical town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was surrounded, cut off, running low on ammunition and medical supplies. On December 26th, 11 CG-4A gliders crash-landed inside the American perimeter at Bastogne, delivering surgical teams, gasoline, and artillery ammunition. 50 more gliders arrived the next day. They flew through German-controlled airspace, landed under fire, and resupplied a surrounded force in the middle of winter. This was impossible by conventional military logic. You couldn't maintain supply lines through enemy territory. You couldn't operate aircraft without air superiority. You couldn't land gliders in contested landing zones and expect them to survive. The Americans did it anyway, because they had gliders to spare. In March of 1945 came Operation Varsity, the crossing of the Rhine River. This was the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. More than 16,000 paratroopers and glider infantry landed on the German side of the Rhine to secure the bridgehead for British Field Marshal Montgomery's ground forces. The glider component involved 906 American WWIIs, each towed by C-47 transport planes, plus hundreds of British horsers. The entire aerial armada stretched 200 miles across the sky. It was warfare at a scale that would have been science fiction just 5 years earlier. The operation was conducted in broad daylight, which made it a shooting gallery for German anti-aircraft guns. The Luftwaffe, though diminished, still had fighters available and threw them against the formation. Gliders were hit by flak, by machine gun fire, by rockets from German fighters. Many never made it to the landing zones. A German soldier, captured shortly after Varsity, was quoted in interrogation reports. "We shot down many of their gliders. We could see them falling, breaking apart in the air. And still they came. There seemed to be no end to them." How do you fight an enemy with such resources? That question, how do you fight an enemy with such resources, was the one German forces had been asking with increasing desperation since 1944. The answer, ultimately, was that you couldn't. Not when the enemy could absorb losses that would cripple any other military and simply continue operations. The final statistics from Operation Varsity tell the story. Of the 906 American gliders that participated, more than 200 were completely destroyed. Many more were damaged beyond repair. Casualties among glider troops were the highest of any airborne operation in the war, nearly 13% killed or wounded just in the landing phase. And yet the operation succeeded. The bridgehead was secured. Montgomery's forces crossed the Rhine with minimal opposition. The war in Europe would be over in 6 weeks. The gliders, by then, were already obsolete. The very qualities that made them useful, the ability to deliver troops and equipment silently to precise locations, would soon be provided by helicopters. The first military helicopters were already in limited service by 1945, and it was obvious to everyone that they represented the future of tactical airlift. But in the critical period from 1943 to 1945, gliders had filled a vital role. They'd enabled operations that simply couldn't have been conducted any other way. They'd delivered thousands of tons of equipment to thousands of soldiers behind enemy lines. They'd turned airborne warfare from a tactical novelty into a strategic capability, and they'd done it through sheer mass production, through the unglamorous application of American industrial capacity to a military problem. The Germans who'd mocked the Plywood gliders learned a hard lesson about modern warfare. It wasn't about building the best weapon. It was about building enough weapons. It wasn't about training the most elite troops. It was about training enough competent troops. It wasn't about craftsmanship. It was about capacity. Consider the fate of Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces in the Ruhr pocket in April of 1945. As American forces closed in, Model's army disintegrated. Supplies ran out. Ammunition was exhausted. Surrounded soldiers surrendered in groups of hundreds, then thousands, until more than 300,000 German troops had given up. Model, facing capture and certain trial as a war criminal, took his own life in a forest outside Duisburg on April 21st. Before he died, he reportedly asked his chief of staff, "What is left for a defeated general?" He'd spent the war condemning other German officers who'd surrendered, insisting that a field marshal must never become a prisoner. In the end, he couldn't face what his soldiers had already understood. They'd been beaten not by better tactics or superior courage, but by an enemy who could simply bring more of everything to the battlefield. More tanks, more planes, more trucks, more ammunition, more food, more medical supplies, more everything. And, yes, more gliders. The irony is that the Germans themselves had pioneered glider warfare. They'd shown the world what was possible at Fort Eben Emael in 1940. They'd used gliders brilliantly in the early years of the war. But they'd thought of gliders as a precision instrument, a tool for elite troops in carefully planned operations. The Americans had taken that same tool and turned it into a blunt instrument, wielded with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, but with devastating effectiveness. In the National Archives, there's a German Army report from late 1944 that analyzes American airborne operations. The analyst notes, with what reads like grudging respect, that American tactics seem to follow a consistent pattern. Overwhelming force, applied without regard for losses, supported by supply lines that appear inexhaustible, sustained by industrial production that we cannot match. Our soldiers fight bravely, but how can courage prevail against such material superiority? That question, how can courage prevail against material superiority, was one the Germans would ask repeatedly in the war's final year. The answer was embedded in the wreckage of 14,000 gliders scattered across Europe. Courage alone couldn't prevail. Superior tactics alone couldn't prevail. Better training alone couldn't prevail. What prevailed was the ability to lose 1,000 gliders and build 1,000 more. What prevailed was the capacity to take 10% casualties in landing zones and still complete the mission. What prevailed was an industrial base so vast that it could afford to treat aircraft as disposable, could plan for 50% losses and still have overwhelming force. This is the story that the gliders tell. Not a story of heroic pilots or perfect landings or technological sophistication. A story of American industrial capacity weaponized, of assembly lines turned toward war production, of a nation that won not because it built the best weapons but because it built the most weapons. The men who flew those gliders knew they were riding in aircraft that were barely airworthy, that had no engines and no second chances, that were designed to crash land and be abandoned. They did it anyway, because there were missions to complete and beachheads to secure and bridges to take. Staff Sergeant Mike Murphy, who we met at the beginning of this story, survived D-Day. He flew 2 more glider missions, one into southern France in Operation Dragoon, one into Germany in Operation Varsity. After the war, he returned to Pennsylvania, worked in a steel mill for 30 years, raised 3 children, and rarely talked about his time as glider infantry. When his grandson asked him, in the 1980s, what it had been like to fly into combat in a glider, Murphy thought for a long time before answering, "Terrifying, but we had a job to do, and somebody had to do it. And we knew, even if we didn't talk about it, that if our glider got shot down, there'd be another one right behind us. That's how we won. Not because we were braver than them, because we had more. That's how they won. More gliders, more troops, more supplies, more of everything. The Germans had invented glider warfare and perfected it. The Americans had industrialized it, turned it into something the world had never seen before. Airborne assault at a scale where individual losses were tragic but operationally irrelevant. By war's end, of the nearly 14,000 CG-4 gliders built, fewer than a dozen survive in museums. Most were destroyed in landings, abandoned in fields, or scrapped for materials. They were never meant to last. They were meant to get soldiers and equipment from point A to point B, once, under the worst possible conditions. And they did exactly that, 13,909 times. The legacy of the American glider program isn't in the museums where the few surviving examples hang from ceilings. It's in the understanding of what industrial warfare means. It's in the recognition that modern conflict isn't won by the side with the best weapons but by the side with enough weapons. It's in the brutal calculus that accepts high losses if the supply of replacements is effectively unlimited. The Germans mocked America's Plywood gliders. They laughed at the crude construction, the cheap materials, the disposable design. They were still laughing when the first wave landed in Normandy. They'd stopped laughing by the time the third wave arrived, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the 100th, because by then they understood. This wasn't about the quality of individual gliders. This was about the capacity to build thousands of them, to treat them as consumables, to operate at a scale where the loss of hundreds of aircraft in a single operation was acceptable, because hundreds more were already being built to replace them. This is what American industrial might look like in World War II, Not sophisticated, not elegant, just overwhelming, relentless, inevitable. 13,000 troops landed behind enemy lines in gliders on D-Day and in the days that followed. Most of those gliders were destroyed. It didn't matter. The troops completed their missions, seized their objectives, held their positions, and somewhere in Ohio, in Michigan, in factories across America, workers who'd been furniture makers and car builders 6 months earlier were already building the next 1,000 gliders. That's the story the Germans couldn't mock their way out of. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.